Welcome to another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer. This is podcast number 20, titled The Merchant's Tongue, The Rise of the English Language. Welcome back, Phoenician Hunter.
Hello, it's good to be back for another one.
Always good to get together and have these deep dives. So let's dive in. So this article you've written seems to follow directly from your book, which is called The Secret World of Words. And based on what I've read, it addresses some of the questions that I and perhaps many other people may have had regarding who are the people responsible for the manipulation of the English language.
Yeah, that was one of my questions as well when I was diving into this whole topic. So while researching my book, it became evident early on that the English language was actually manufactured or altered to contain this maritime nautical feature that, we've discussed in previous episodes and which I show in my book. I have mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating, and I'll do so here. I take the view that our environment is a reflection of our thoughts and our mind. These are influenced by language. So, the words we hear, what we read, the language we speak. I view language simply as the program that, is running everything that we run off. And in order for the English merchants to dominate the world, they first needed to control the language that the world speaks. Okay, so they needed the program first. Therefore, if English is the international language spoken around the world, then it dominates the world view. And English, as I show, is a language of merchants. This is why the world today that we live in is a reflection of commerce and materialism.
Sure.
Because it's their world, it's their program. And to me, it is self-evident that a world driven by consumerism, which we have today, would benefit above all a merchant banker class.
Sure. Okay, so you begin by looking into the evolution of the English language. Can you maybe spend a little bit of time telling us about that?
Okay, yeah. So, I had to go back and look at the development of the language and sort of try and pinpoint where the heavy modifications came into place. And so, what we're told is that the English language evolved throughout three major periods. So we've got what they call Old English, Middle English, and then, Modern English. Also, that English today is mostly a result, a combination of Latin, Old Norse, and Norman French. Okay. So a good way to think about it is it's similar to the progression of computers' operating system. Okay. So, today most people would use, Windows 11. I think that, I don't know, I use a Mac. So I don't know what most people are using on PC.
Sure.
What the latest is. So
No, that makes sense.
So Windows 11, for instance, allows people to do much more than, Windows 1 or Windows 3 did. Okay. So it improves, these operating systems, these new updates that they do, improves with, minor adjustments and additions, with every time they come out with a new update. And language works in the same way. So they update it. So the thing is, we don't notice the updates because they happen. We're going through updates at the moment.
Sure.
But because they're slow and they introduce words or they modify words or they take out or they change the meaning of words, right? So that's, a big one too. The word, just at the top of my head, gay used to mean happy.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, when people use that word, they associate with something else, right?
Yep.
So it's the same with a lot of words. They change the meanings or they change the spellings.
Yep.
So this happens constantly. It's just that, as it's happening, we're not noticing it.
Okay. Well, one of these updates that you mention in the article is what you've referred to as the Great Vowel Shift, where you say that it was a series of changes in the pronunciation of the English language that took place primarily between 1400 and 1700. And can I just maybe continue just briefly before I get you to look at that we know that the period between 1400 and 1700 is generally referred to as the Renaissance and the early modern period. So it's a mixture of two periods where we know the Renaissance is a period of cultural and intellectual rebirth, and early modern encompasses a much broader range of historical and culture developments, which includes the Renaissance, obviously. It also includes the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. So what's your take on the Great Vowel Shift?
Okay, it's interesting you brought up the Renaissance, and I'll get back to that later because that does play a major part in the
Mm,
story.
mm,
Okay, I'll get to that later. With the vowel shift, yes, I believe this was the time of a major upgrade to the language. Okay,
mm.
so a major operating system upgrade.
Okay.
And this period, remember, also coincides with the invention of the printing press in
Okay.
1440. Okay, so this is a major step because the printing press allows them to speed up the process immensely. It's like when, the internet hit.
Sure.
All of a sudden, you can get all these, because you got to understand books in the old times were written by hand. So
Mm,
it'd take years to write. Imagine you had to write, a thousand books.
mm.
You had to produce a thousand books. Doing it by hand would take forever.
Sure.
But with the development of the printing press, you can get thousands of books printed quickly and distributed to a large population. So this helped. And we also need to remember that at the time, the 1400s, French was the language of the upper class in England. So the aristocracy, the government, the nobility, whatever, they were speaking in and writing in French.
Mm,
Okay.
mm,
And in fact, there was a surprise to me while researching that English wasn't even in use until the late 1400s. Okay.
Wow. Okay. Well, that makes perfect sense. Well, if I can just go on from
Yeah.
what you've just said, I'd like to paraphrase from your article, if I could, where you write that it's not until 1362 that Middle English was used for the first time at the opening of Parliament in what is now known as the Pleading in English Act, and only by, I think it was the early 1400s, was Middle English widely used in England, both in writing and in speech. Now, again, before I go, for the benefit of our listeners, because we can't just throw words and not know what they are, but the Pleading Act, or the Pleading in English Act, was also known as the Statute of Pleading. So, just briefly, it was an English law that mandated the use of English in courts rather than French, which had always been used in the past. And it aimed to make legal proceedings more accessible to the common people by using a language that they understood. And while the Act shifted the language of the courts to English, it didn't fully replace French as the language of the law itself. I just thought I'd put that in because it
Now
hasn't.
that's very
Yeah,
interesting because how if the people didn't speak French, right?
yeah, yeah.
How the hell are they supposed to follow the laws of the
That,
nation?
that that's exactly right. So,
You
and
know what I mean? It's like so.
but again,
Yeah,
this is where your deep dive, makes a lot of sense, and it shines light on why this happened.
yeah. So, and we find this like if you look at European history, a lot of the ruling class and the monarchs would speak a different language to the people. I think it was the
That's right.
same in the Holy Roman Empire as well. And
That's right.
you got your ruler who doesn't even speak he's not running on your program. You know what I
Wow.
mean?
Yeah.
Just think about it for a sec. It's just
Mm. Power and
it, it's
control. Yeah.
it's only in modern times where they've aligned, the monarch with the people,
Right.
basically.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if and you were saying with the British royal family, I mean, they were Germans, so I mean, they weren't even
That's
English.
that's
So the
right.
ruling class wasn't even English. Ruling over
Mm.
your nation.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll keep that in mind when we talk about language as well.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So yeah, I think you will find that it was probably the same in most modern languages as well. So modern languages seem to begin with the introduction of the printing press. So around the
Mm.
1400s, okay? So
Mm.
it's this story is not only relevant to England and English. For example, right, modern Italian was formed from the Florentine dialect. And this
Okay.
begins in the 14th century, predominantly with the works of Dante. So
Yeah.
Dante's writing his works in Florentine dialect that become the national language eventually. So yeah,
Sure.
and also for people who are not aware, Florence is another great merchant city. It's similar to the city of London,
Mm.
full of ancient, trade guilds and merchant guilds. And
Mm.
actually, I believe, and I've written an article on this where I cover it called "Wolves in Sheep's Clothing" for
Yes. Of
people who
course.
are interested.
Great article, by the way.
Yeah, if they want to read more on that. And, I found that the trade and merchant guilds like the City of London were modeled off these ones in Florence. So,
Mm.
Florence is the beginning of this stuff, and that's why they became the early bankers of Europe as well. Florence has a major part to play in this whole story as well. Just wanted to touch on that. And also, getting back to your question, or your point earlier about the Renaissance, right? I just wanted to touch on that.
Okay.
And I think we've mentioned this in previous chats as well, and how the introduction of the printing press is also the beginning of the Renaissance period, all right? So it happens, yeah, at the same time. And this is the time that I refer to as the Great Reset, because to me, I believe this is when they sort of reshaped civilization from the old world, coming into the modern world.
Mm.
So this is when they reshaped national borders, also language, like I said, the beginning of English, Italian, and many others. Art, architecture was looked at, literature and religion all got a makeover, because this is also, according to Johnson, when he believes Christianity was created and rolled out. So around this period as well. The reason for this is debatable. Perhaps an old power overthrew the previous one and wanted to erase all memory of it, or they wanted to erase memory of a recent catastrophe that had occurred. And, there's evidence for that as well. Whatever it was, something major happened, and they felt this was the time to change the worldview, the world program, basically.
Okay, so it's clear that something major happened, but when you talk catastrophe, what are you actually referring to? Is there something specific?
Well, let's not forget, this is also, the period when they're coming out of the Great Plague as well. The plague that I don't believe, was a result of, rats. So
Mm.
something occurred from either a celestial body passing by or hitting the earth, or
Right.
it needs its own podcast and its own article, but other people have
Okay.
written about it. And I think it's a major part of this whole story, and why they were sort of, I call, reset the earth, reset civilization, because it was in ruin.
Around the 14th century.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think around the 14th century is when they're coming out of the catastrophe period. So,
Right, so it was earlier
the
than that.
catastrophe period could have lasted 100 years or 200 years.
Sure,
So
sure. Getting back to your article, you mentioned Geoffrey Chaucer, who was the English poet, author, and civil servant. He's best known for works like The Parliament of Foils, Troilus and Cressade, and of course, what you're about to talk about is the Canterbury Tales. So, how does he fit into the story? Can you tell us a bit about him?
So yeah, he is also called the father of English literature. So it is said that almost 2,000 English words are first used in his writings. So, almost one would say shaped the English language. And this, from his works, Middle English then becomes the dominant language in England.
Mm.
So again, this is around the 1400s. So this is why they're creating this new or modified English, and then they're unleashing it on the populace. All right. So, and then they always got to attribute this to an author. We'll get to that in a moment.
Mm.
So, the Middle English period is when it begins a continuous process of sound and spelling changes. All right. So there's continuous changes happening. And this is when we see things like, the SC, became SH or SCH, and then becomes SHIP for ship. So
Mhm.
this is, to me, a clue when, we see an early appearance of the maritime character of the English language, which I cover in my book. And, we've spoken about this in other podcasts, like Aboard the Citizenship. So this is when the water spellings are being cast, okay? You start seeing these nautical spellings in the
Okay, so,
English language. Yeah.
and this is why you say in your article, through the manipulation of language, spellings, the merchants or the water chanters cast a water enchantment over mankind.
Exactly. This is when when I was first researching my book, I thought it would be impossible to sort of pinpoint when this happened and who did it. But actually, I researched enough to find a trail and clues that led me to where I believe the evidence is quite clear when it's happening and who's doing it. And other authors helped me along the way, and one of them was Edwin Johnson, because Edwin Johnson claims that in one of his books that Geoffrey is not the true author of the Canterbury Tales or any of his other works. And this made me think, okay, so, Johnson says that they were actually written by what he calls, so he identified as the Caxton Guild. So, this brings me to another point where, a number of researchers have claimed that some of the most important literature that we have today, like the Bible or the works of Shakespeare, Dante, and this extends to music as well, like Mozart, I've heard, that these works, they were actually penned by anonymous authors, right? Usually to further an agenda, and then they're prescribed to, they're given a name, like a character, like say Shakespeare, for instance,
Mm,
or Dante, but their works are actually done by another group
mm,
or a secret fraternity. Yeah, I believe it's not one writer who's writing this. It's like a group of people, like merchants or monks, for
mm,
instance. And for example, when I was looking into Dante's writings, then I found a link to someone who I'd never heard of before, and his name is Joachim of Fiore, who was an Italian monk from Calabria.
okay.
And if you look at his writings, they say he was the inspiration for Dante's works later on.
Mm,
So there's a lot of this stuff going on. And, we just know the famous names. And I just believe like they're characters
mm,
and they're not the ones who are actually doing it because there's a hidden agenda here.
mm.
So that's why I believe it's not the names that history gives us.
Yeah, look,
That,
yeah. No, I was going to say that I too am of the belief that some or a lot of the most important literature that we've been sold was written by a group than by one individual. And it's not just isolated to major works, they've been attributed to one person for whatever reason. Like you said, it could be the priest class, or whether it's just to promote a person because he was of somebody of influence or whatever. I'm not sure. We'll probably ever know. But again, it's you're shedding a lot more light. And you also mentioned to me, and this follows on from what you've just said, and you mentioned this to me in private, how hidden esoteric themes and symbology present in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter films made you specifically question who actually wrote them. And
yeah,
I too have my doubts.
Yeah, that's a big one because I don't believe for a second that those novels were authored by her. I mean, the amount of literature and exposure to the occult knowledge one needs to understand, right, the hidden themes throughout those films,
Mm,
clearly seen like when you watch the films, not everyone's going to pick up on them, but I know a little bit of the occult, and and I could pick up the themes quite easily.
mm,
But I'm thinking, there's no way this person has put this together herself. There's no way. There's just too much knowledge
mm,
and experience and exposure, like I said, for her to have obtained to write those books in the way that they are. And I mean, this goes on. She's not the only one. I mean, this goes on today with film and
mm,
music. Music is a big one where I don't believe we really know the true writers behind that, the lyrics and the books and films. They attribute them to some person, but
mm,
it's questionable if that person actually wrote them. And the idea, I mean, put it this way, the way I see it is if a studio or a publisher came out and said, here, look, we got this book or this film and it was produced by the Tavistock Institute or, this Masonic lodge, who's going to watch it? I mean, people
mm.
or people will watch it, but no, all of a sudden that they're going to question the motives behind it. So, you know,
Yeah, the good old Tavistock Institute, hey, it's and but based on my readings, and again, they claim that this is all conspiracy theory stuff, but they've been connected to some well-known projects, and people, our listeners will know this, and those projects include the Beatles, Pink Floyd, the Doors, the Rolling Stones, David Bowie, Led Zeppelin. Edward Bernays, who's considered the father of PR, Sigmund Freud, Aldous Huxley. Again,
wow.
yeah,
It-
maybe we should do a chat about the Tavistock Institute and see where that takes us. But anyhow, let's get back to the article. I know that's
No,
if
that's interesting actually that you bring
mm,
that up because I didn't know all those names were connected to the Tavistock
yeah,
Institute, but I knew it was a very influential think tank. And
yeah,
those
yeah,
names you mentioned,
yeah.
how influential are those people
Well, that's
or were
exactly
those?
right, and that's the point, right?
And that's the point. So all those people you mentioned, if they all said they came out and said, and these lyrics and these things are, produced by the Tavistock Institute
Yeah.
in collaboration with all those people you mentioned.
Yeah.
People are not they're going to be suspicious about the motives, and they're not going to just go along with the program and be indoctrinated.
That's
So,
right.
and that is the whole purpose of having these anonymous writers
Yes.
and pen names.
Yeah.
And this is what I'm trying to show, that this isn't new. This happened all the way back from, the beginning with the Canterbury Tales, like we mentioned, and the people behind it were these. We'll get to that, but Johnson identified as the Caxton Guild, and we'll talk about what that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
next.
Well, and again, it's a nice little segue so we can jump back into your article. You do mention earlier the Caxton Guild. I know you're going to talk about it in a sec, but just as a precursor, it was founded by William Caxton in 1476, and he was attributed as to bringing the printing presses to England. And correct me if I'm wrong, which essentially, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, it made books accessible and it was influencing the standardization of the English language.
Yeah, like I said, Edwin Johnson, the author that I quote quite extensively, was the one who alerted me to this Caxton Guild. So when I looked into it, who's this guild he's referring to is, surprise, surprise, the Merciers Livery Company of the City of London,
Okay.
which is, I just finished writing an article about them called the Premier Merchants, because they were the top merchants in the City of London. So Johnson is suggesting here that this guild is the ones that funded
Wow.
this English printer
Okay.
that you've mentioned, William Caxton.
Wow.
And like you were saying, he's the one who introduced the printing press into England. And, I found that he also was a member of the Merciers Company. So, okay, it's quite
so connected. My God.
You mean they tell you, this is the thing. You just dig, and they're telling you all the connections are there. So he's a member himself. He's funded by this guild. Like you mentioned, he's credited with translating a large number of works into English from the Latin classics and many French books that weren't in English. You got to understand, English wasn't. Before the 1400s, wasn't really spoken and written. And there was a form of English spoken among the peasants, but it wasn't the English that we understand today. So, this is being produced at this time. So the introduction of the printing press is known also as the modern English period. So this is when there was a major push to create a standard language. And within 150 years, they say about 20,000 books appeared in that short period. Okay, because they started from nothing.
Yeah.
So they're pushing all this stuff out, right? So they're pushing this new program very hard at this point. It's just like in recent years with climate change and the LBGT movement, or Black Lives Matter. These movements sort of artificially explode on the scene very quickly.
Yeah.
And then they appear everywhere and all over the world. The guilds are also not only printing and translating books into English, they are also at this time manufacturing English history. All right, they're creating the stories. Okay, they're creating the stories, they're inventing history, the English history. That's part of the program as well.
And in your article, you do say that by about 1470 and aided by the printing press, a standard English based on the London dialects had become established. And I think you mentioned it as being known as the Chancery Standard.
Yeah, that's what they call it. The Chancery Standard, they say, helped formalize English spelling, and it is considered the closest source to, our modern day English that we speak today. Basically what they're saying is that modern English is based on the dialect of London, the city, right? The city of the merchant and trade guilds. Okay. So
this is interesting. Yeah.
Just absorb that for a moment. So English is the dialect of the merchant city, the great city of London.
Hence the title of your article, The Merchant's Tongue. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Exactly. Therefore, that's where we got the title. I got the title, right. So this period also marks the beginning of the English Empire, okay, and their march towards, becoming the world dominant power, okay, superpower. So this all happens at the same time, right? And it's no accident because it occurs alongside the improvements of the spoken word. So they're modifying the language and they're advancing the empire at the same time. So because we have to remember that the language that we speak is the operating system
Yes.
that we operate on. So the British Empire was operating off the English language, and and it was creating the reality that they wanted at the same
Mm.
time. So once the merchants had this, the correct program that they wanted, then they could dominate the seas. If you dominate the seas, you dominate the world. And
Of
we've
course.
gone through that in detail in the connection between sea and commerce and why it's so important.
Can I just interject here and say that
Yeah.
people can listen to our previous podcast, which I encourage them to do because all this will start to make a lot more sense. They can access it on our YouTube channel at On Air Podcasts 2025. But what I would suggest first and foremost is to hit your Substack channel at phoenicianhunter.substack.com just to read these articles because they're nice, short, very well researched articles. Won't take people long to read, and if they want a longer version, then they can always go to our YouTube channel.
We covered the sea and the commerce and the connection to money and the merchants in our recent podcast called Aboard the Citizenship. So people can go to that one, can refer to that one. I just wanted to mention also that this program that has gone, the English program that's gone through, major changes over the years, is still occurring today. And, like I mentioned earlier, you don't really notice it while, we're living in the moment. So the program is changing and it's evident in the world around us, okay? So, one of those is, I hate to say this, but I see it in the collapse of the English speaking world. Canada and Australia and even America have recently had elections. I mean, the UK did too. I think this year, was it this year or last year?
I think it
Anyway,
was
so
last year, but yeah.
yeah, we can see the turmoil that's occurring in those nations now, and there's major, major changes there happening, and that we're seeing. And I saw these changes occurring in the language before they manifest in the physical. Okay, so this is something that you will notice if you look at language. It hits the language first, and then it manifests in reality. And a lot of these things that people are, it's hitting them today, like speaking to a lot of people in Australia with the recent elections, and they're sort of really shocked and distraught by it. I wasn't, and I was predicting long ago where it was heading because I was following the language and the words and what they were speaking about, what, the powers, the people in charge were speaking, and can see where it was heading. And today, unfortunately, I see it manifest, and I'm not happy about the outcome because I still have attachments to Australia and the English speaking world, but there's something happening there where they're changing the program and then changing the reality of those places. And yeah, unfortunately, it's not going to be an easy ride for a lot of people there.
Well, it's not, and if change is going to happen, it's going to take generations for that, if it actually happens at all. So, and I know that you and I talk a lot about this off air, but again, that's perhaps for another discussion. Well, look, we've reached the end of, again, what I would consider to be one of the most important podcasts we've done because language is obviously fascinating to both of us, but also to the masses. Do you have any closing comments for our listeners?
It seems, looking at the evidence, that the Mercier's company sponsored this Caxton operation, right? So with the help of the printing press, they were able to roll out this new modified English on a massive scale quickly. This is why they wanted everyone also at schools. This is when they started, just after that, schools reading books, because that's the way everyone is going to start learning the new program. So how else would you learn it unless you're taught how to spell and write correctly? It's not only as you've mentioned, schools to dumb you down, but it's also to get you, on the right operating system, basically.
That's right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
good analogy. Yeah.
So, yeah, the merchants, I believe their aim was not only the creation of this new language or program, but also in extension of that to create a new world. And, this world would benefit the merchant class above all. And this reality is clearly evident today in the world we live in. I mean, that's what started me on this, this journey to begin with, because I'm saying I'm looking at the world and I say, okay, so what is it? And And then you look at that and you say, wow, it's a materialistic, predominantly commercial, enterprise. And so, all right, who would that benefit, and who would create that? It's evident to me it's a merchant class. So you look at them, you look at their activities. So I was able to trace this way back to this point in time when the English language became the dominant program. And see, this is another thing. Sorry, I'm going off on a rant now, but people say, "Oh, it's the Vatican rules the world," or that's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, but I don't see the world running off Latin
That's right.
or,
That's
or,
right.
or Italian. We're running off what? What's the international language? In English, right?
English. Yeah.
That's the program, and that's the program that has created this reality that we live in. It's not the Vatican that's created this reality.
Mm.
Now, let me just say, okay, the Vatican, or no, not Vatican is incorrect. The Roman Empire had merchant trade guilds as well. Okay,
Mm.
it's nothing
Mm.
new.
Mm.
These trade guilds I've traced all the way back to the Roman Empire, and also with the introduction of Christianity, they were still, just like before, under the control of the Pope. Before it became Christian, it was under the control of the emperor, the high priest. That title didn't change with with the Pope. The Pope is still the high priest. The Bishop of Rome is the title of both the emperor and the Catholic Pope, right?
Mm.
They controlled the trade guilds. But then these trade guilds over time, you had your German ones with the Hansa League, you know, you had Dutch trade guilds, you had, like I said earlier, in Florence, you had the trade guilds, and then you had the ones in England. What I think has happened here is you had the ones in Venice. What I think you have here is the ones in England have taken over. They've taken over control, dominating the world, okay?
Mm.
This is why I believe that there's not this one power that's ruled forever, like a lot of people prescribe to.
Mm.
And you can see this. You see it in the language with the shifts in power and the language and the dominance, as we've said, the dominance of the sea. Who holds dominance of the sea changes as well.
Mm.
And today it's the English. And what I believe by looking at the language and what's happening today is that power is changing, that's shifting. That's why we're seeing turmoil, especially in the English speaking world.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and people might think, oh no, English is so dominant around the world. That's never going to change.
Mm.
English as the international language, I think it's only what, 100, 150 years. It was
Yeah.
French before that, and then it
Well,
was Latin
yeah.
before
Well,
that.
you do see the turmoil today in predominantly the Commonwealth countries, United Kingdom, Australia, not so much South Africa, but Canada, the US. So change is afoot. And again, it comes down to the bare basics of language and how it's been manipulated. So,
Well, if you want to change your reality, if you want to change the world, and a lot of people, have said, the world is going on the wrong course.
mm,
We need to change something, right? Changing political parties is not going to change it.
that's
Okay.
right. That's right.
You need to change what? The reality. How do you do that? You
Mm,
change it through the language.
of
You
course.
change the program. And that's what I think is happening today. Probably won't happen in my lifetime, but I don't believe English is going to be the international language forever. And also, I've just heard and I've seen some articles that France is pushing for the EU to replace English with Latin as the
Mm,
language used predominantly between the EU,
wow.
the official, EU language in Parliament and that. So,
Because Latin has pretty much disappeared. Used
I
to
mean,
be
not
quite prevalent.
Yeah, not even the church uses it
No,
anymore. I
that's right.
mean,
That's right.
they banned Latin Mass, so it might come back through the EU. It'll be interesting to see that. It won't take long, because you think, okay, so a child starting school, the child is fresh to languages, right? They're starting new. So if they're taught Latin as soon as they start school,
Mm,
within a couple of generations, it's not going to take long
that's right.
for it to be, spoken again. So I'm not saying it's going to be Latin, but there are indicators that it might be. So
Mm,
either Latin or a modified version of another language. But to me, it can only be Latin or a modified English. But
Okay. Well, that is interesting. I guess there are a lot of areas that we can branch off into other podcasts. But look, this was a deeper dive into who was responsible for the manipulation of the English language as we know it today. So you can download Phoenician Hunter's book, The Secret World of Words, which addresses some of these issues that we have spoken about today, which Phoenician Hunter has kindly detailed based on his article, and which also shine a light on the etymology of the English language and what it all means. Definitely a fascinating read. You can download it, as I mentioned earlier, phoenicianhunter.substack.com. So thanks again for joining us again for a wonderful discussion, Phoenician Hunter.
thank you. And, I think we've mentioned before, and we hope to do more of these moving forward. They seem to be well received. So
Excellent, and continue your excellent work. Remember to subscribe to both Phoenician Hunter's Substack channel, as mentioned earlier, and our YouTube channel at On Air Podcast 2025 to listen to every podcast we've produced. This is obviously podcast number 20, and of course, our YouTube podcasts are free. So until next time, stay well.